Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what's written in a will, it's what's hidden beneath years of silence. When 32-year-old Jesse Cutter returns to his grandfather's homestead after the old man's passing, he expects nothing but dust and fading memories. The lawyer had made it crystal clear: no money, no land, nothing left behind. But while preparing his granddad's horse one final time, Jesse discovers a rusted iron key wedged beneath the worn saddle. That key leads to an abandoned shed and a chest filled with secrets that shake everything he thought he knew about the man who raised him. What had his grandfather kept buried all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you: the gravel crunched under the tires of Jesse's dusty Ford pickup as he turned off Highway 789 and onto the long dirt road leading to the Cutter homestead. He hadn't been back in 3 years, not since that Christmas when he and his grandfather had argued about something Jesse couldn't even remember now. Pride, probably, or stubbornness. The Cutter men were good at both. The Wyoming landscape stretched out in every direction, vast and unforgiving in its beauty. Late September had painted the cottonwoods along the creek bed in shades of gold and amber, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling pasture land. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dry grass, smells that pulled Jesse back to childhood with an almost physical force. He was 32 years old, and he'd spent most of those years trying to figure out where he belonged. After the divorce 2 years ago, he'd been drifting from ranch to ranch, hiring on as seasonal help, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. His ex-wife, Sarah, used to say he had a talent for leaving before anyone could leave him first. She wasn't wrong. The homestead came into view as he crested the final hill. The house stood weathered and gray, a 2-story farmhouse that had seen better days. The barn leaned slightly to the east, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Granddad's old Chevy sat in the yard, wheels sunk into the dirt where it had been parked for the last 5 years after his license was revoked. Everything looked smaller than Jesse remembered, and sadder somehow. He parked near the porch and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. His grandfather was gone. William Bill Cutter, 79 years old, had died in his sleep 4 days ago. The doctors said his heart just gave out. Jesse had gotten the call from Tom Brennan, the family lawyer, while he was shoeing horses on a ranch outside Sheridan. "Your grandfather passed peacefully," Tom had said. He left instructions. "The funeral's Saturday if you can make it." Jesse had made it barely. He'd driven through the night, arrived at the church with red eyes and stubble on his jaw, wearing the only clean shirt he had. The service had been small. A handful of old ranchers, Miguel Alvarez, who'd worked for Granddad for 30 years, Tom and his wife, and a few people from town Jesse didn't recognize. No family beyond Jesse himself. His father had died in a logging accident when Jesse was 5, and his mother had remarried and moved to Oregon, her Christmas cards growing less frequent each year until they stopped altogether. The will reading had been even briefer than the funeral. Tom had sat Jesse down in his small office on Main Street, adjusting his reading glasses with the careful precision of a man who delivered bad news before. "Jesse, I'm going to be straight with you," Tom had said. "There's no easy way to say this. The homestead is mortgaged to the hilt. Your grandfather took out loans against it 15 years ago, and then again 8 years back. Between what's owed to the bank and his medical bills, there's nothing left. The property will need to be sold to settle the debts." Jesse had nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He'd expected as much. Ranching was hard, and Granddad had been alone out there for years. Too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to sell while he was still breathing. "There's no cash. No savings, no life insurance," Tom had continued. "He left you his personal effects, clothes, tools, that sort of thing. But in terms of monetary inheritance, I'm afraid there's nothing." "What about the land itself?" Jesse had asked. "After the debts are paid?" Tom had shaken his head. "There won't be anything left." "I'm sorry, son. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Jesse had thanked him and walked out into the bright afternoon, feeling hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with money. It wasn't the inheritance that hurt. He'd never expected one. It was the finality of it all. The knowledge that the last tie to his family, to his history, was about to be sold off to strangers. Now he sat in front of that house, the key to the front door heavy in his pocket. Tom had given it to him after the reading, along with permission to take whatever personal items he wanted before the estate sale. "Take your time," Tom had said. "You've got until the end of the month before the bank takes possession." Jesse climbed out of the truck and stood in the yard, the wind tugging at his hair. The place looked abandoned already, as if it knew its days were numbered. He walked up the porch steps, noting the loose boards that needed fixing, the railing that wobbled under his hand. The front door opened with a creak that seemed too loud in the stillness. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dust and something else. His grandfather's aftershave, maybe, or the particular scent of a life lived in one place for decades. Jesse moved through the rooms slowly, taking inventory of a lifetime. The furniture was old, but well-maintained, the kind of pieces that had been built to last. Photographs lined the mantel, his grandparents on their wedding day, his father as a young boy, Jesse himself at various ages, always with a gap-toothed smile and dirt on his face. He paused in front of a picture of his grandmother, Dorothy. She died when he was 12, and his memories of her were soft-edged and warm. She'd made the best apple pie in 3 counties and had a laugh that could fill a room. In the photo, she stood next to Granddad, both of them young and happy. A future stretched out before them, like the Wyoming plains. Jesse had spent his summers here as a boy, and later as a teenager when his mother couldn't handle him anymore. Granddad had taught him everything about ranching. How to mend fence, how to read the weather, how to gentle a horse with patience instead of force. Those had been good years, maybe the best years of Jesse's life, before everything got complicated. He climbed the stairs to his old bedroom. The twin bed was still there, covered with the same faded quilt his grandmother had made. His dresser held a collection of arrowheads he'd found as a kid, and a rodeo trophy from the county fair when he was 16. He sat on the edge of the bed, springs creaking, and felt the weight of memory pressing down on him. The argument 3 years ago came back to him now. It had been about Sarah, about the divorce that was already in motion by then. Granddad had asked why Jesse couldn't make it work, why he had to run from everything good in his life. Jesse had gotten defensive, said some things he regretted, and stormed out. He'd meant to come back, meant to apologize, but time had a way of getting away from a person. And now Granddad was gone, and Jesse would never get the chance to tell him he was sorry. He descended the stairs and went out the back door to the barn. Miguel's truck was parked near the entrance, and Jesse found the old ranch hand inside, forking hay to the horses. There were only 2 left, Granddad's mare, Rosie, and the old gelding, Buck. "Jesse," Miguel said, straightening up. He was in his 60s, weathered and lean, with kind eyes that had seen a lot of life. "Good to see you, son." They shook hands, and Miguel pulled him into a brief, firm hug. "I'm sorry about Bill," Miguel said. "He was a good man. One of the best I ever worked for." "Thanks, Miguel. I appreciate you looking after the place. It's nothing. These old horses need feeding, and someone had to keep an eye on things until Tom figured out what to do with it all." Miguel leaned on his pitchfork. "You planning to take anything from the house?" "Maybe a few things. Photos mostly, reminders." Miguel nodded. "Your granddad, he talked about you near the end. Said he wished you'd come visit more, but he understood you had your own life to live. He was proud of you, Jesse, even if he didn't always know how to say it." Jesse's throat tightened. "I should have been better about staying in touch. We all should do a lot of things different," Miguel said. "But beating yourself up won't change the past. Bill knew you loved him. That's what matters." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the horses munching hay in their stalls, dust motes drifting through the shafts of sunlight that pierced the barn's dim interior. "I'm going to saddle up Rosie," Jesse said. "Take her out one last time before everything gets sold off." "You mind?" "Course not. She could use the exercise. Been cooped up too long." Jesse gathered Rosie's tack from the equipment room, her bridle hanging on its familiar peg, the saddle blanket folded neatly on the shelf. And then he saw it, his grandfather's old saddle, the one he'd ridden for 40 years, sitting on its stand in the corner. The leather was worn smooth in places, dark with age and use. The tooling on the edges still visible but faded. Jesse ran his hand over the seat, feeling the contours shaped by his grandfather's body over decades. This was the saddle Granddad had used to work cattle, to ride fence lines, to teach Jesse how to sit a horse properly. It had been a part of him, as much as his boots or his hat. On impulse, Jesse decided to use it instead of Rosie's regular tack. It felt right somehow to sit in his grandfather's saddle one more time, to feel connected to the old man in this small way. He hoisted it off the stand, surprised by its weight, and carried it to Rosie's stall. The mare nickered softly as he approached, recognizing the familiar gear. He placed the saddle blanket on her back, smoothing it into position, then lifted the saddle up and over. As he did, something shifted beneath the seat. Jesse felt it, a subtle movement, something loose where nothing should be. He lowered the saddle to the ground and examined it more carefully. The leather under the seat had a small tear he hadn't noticed before, and when he pressed his fingers against it, he felt something hard underneath. Working carefully, Jesse widened the tear just enough to reach inside. His fingers closed around cold metal, small, heavy, deliberately hidden. He pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a key, old and iron, rusted around the edges but still solid. The kind of key that opened old locks, the kind that belonged to something important. A piece of twine was looped through the hole at the top, as if it had once been worn around someone's neck. Jesse turned it over in his palm, his heart beating faster. Why would his grandfather hide a key inside his saddle? What did it open? And more importantly, why had he kept it secret? Miguel appeared in the stall doorway. "You find something?" Jesse showed him the key. It was hidden under the saddle seat. "Any idea what it might be for?" Miguel's expression grew thoughtful. He took the key, examined it, then handed it back. "Can't say I do." But Bill was a private man, kept his own counsel about a lot of things. If he hid that there, he had his reasons. Jesse closed his fist around the key, feeling its weight, its possibilities. Something stirred in his chest. Curiosity, yes, but also something deeper. A sense that this small piece of rusted metal was important, that his grandfather had left it for someone to find. "Left it for him to find. I think I'll hold off on that ride," Jesse said. "I need to look around the property, see if I can figure out what this opens." Miguel nodded slowly. "You do that. And Jesse, if you find something your grandfather wanted kept private, you think real careful before you go sharing it with the world. Some secrets are kept for good reasons." Jesse met his eyes. "You know something about this." "I know Bill Cutter was a complicated man with a long life behind him. That's all any of us really knows about anybody." Miguel tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. "Check the old storage shed, out past the north pasture. Bill spent time out there sometimes, when he wanted to be alone with his thoughts. Haven't been inside it myself in years, kept it locked tight, but if that key opens anything, my money would be on that shed." After Miguel left, Jesse stood in the barn with the key in his hand and 100 questions in his head. The logical part of him said it was probably nothing, just an old key to a shed full of junk or farm equipment or tools that were too worn out to use. But the part of him that had been drifting for years, searching for something he couldn't name, felt the pull of mystery, the promise of discovery. He thought about his grandfather in those final years, alone in this house, keeping his secrets, carrying his burdens without complaint. What had the old man hidden away? What had he deemed important enough to conceal but not destroy? Jesse slipped the key into his pocket and headed for the door. The afternoon sun was already dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He had maybe 2 hours of good light left. Plenty of time to walk out to the old shed and satisfy his curiosity. As he left the barn, Rosie whinnied softly behind him, as if she understood that something had shifted, that the course of the day, maybe the course of everything, had just changed direction. Jesse didn't look back. He was already thinking ahead, already imagining what he might find, already feeling the first stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. purpose. Wes woke to a sound he couldn't immediately place, a rhythmic scraping, almost frantic, coming from somewhere outside. The room was still dark, dawn just beginning to grey the edges of the broken window. He'd spent the night in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the one that seemed least likely to collapse under him. The mattress was ancient but serviceable, and exhaustion had pulled him under, despite the strangeness of sleeping in a dead man's house. The scraping continued. Insistent and oddly purposeful, he pulled on his boots and headed downstairs, careful on steps that creaked under his weight. The house smelled like dust and abandonment, though someone, probably a neighbor, had clearly been inside recently. There was no rot, no animal infestation, just the scent of a place that had been waiting for someone to come back. Outside, the early morning air was cool and sharp. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, painting the sky in shades of deep blue and purple. Wes stood on the sagging porch, trying to locate the source of the noise. It was coming from the orchard. He walked across the yard, boots crunching on dry earth and dead grass. As he got closer, he could make out Clyde's silhouette among the twisted apple trees. The donkey was digging, front hooves pawing at the ground with surprising energy for an animal that looked half dead most of the time. "Hey!" Wes called out. "What are you doing?" Clyde ignored him completely, focused entirely on whatever he was excavating. Dirt flew out behind the donkey's hooves in small explosions. The hole was already a couple of feet across and getting deeper. Wes approached cautiously. The paddock fence was broken down on one side. That's how Clyde had gotten out. The donkey must have pushed through the old boards, driven by some animal instinct or madness that Wes couldn't begin to understand. "Come on, old man. Let's get you back to the barn." He reached for Clyde's halter, but the donkey swung his head away and resumed digging with renewed intensity. There was something almost desperate about it, like Clyde needed to reach whatever was down there. Wes tried 3 more times to lead the donkey away, and 3 more times Clyde refused to budge. The animal was surprisingly strong for something that looked like it should be in a retirement home for livestock. Frustration finally got the better of him. "Fine," Wes muttered. "You want to dig? Let's dig." He marched back to the barn, found a serviceable shovel among the scattered tools, and returned to the orchard. If nothing else, maybe he could dig down to whatever Clyde was after, prove there was nothing there, and then get the stubborn animal back where he belonged. Wes planted the shovel and started working. The ground was hard-packed but manageable once he got through the top layer. Clyde stepped aside, as if he'd been waiting for someone with proper tools to take over. The donkey watched intently, that good eye tracking every shovel full of dirt, 1 foot down. 2 feet, nothing but packed earth and rocks. Wes was about to give up when the shovel hit something that rang metallic. He stopped, heart suddenly beating faster. Probably just an old pipe or piece of junk buried here decades ago. But he cleared away more dirt, working carefully now, and his hands touched something that definitely wasn't junk. A metal case. Rectangular, about the size of a large toolbox. Waterproof rubber seals around the edges, coated in dirt, but not particularly rusty. It was heavy. Wes had to work to lift it out of the hole and set it on the ground. Clyde huffed softly, a sound that somehow conveyed satisfaction. The case wasn't locked, just latched. Wes knelt beside it, aware that his hands were shaking slightly. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were 3 gold bars. Wes stared at them for a long moment, brain struggling to process what he was seeing. They were small, maybe 8 inches long and 3 inches wide, but dense and obviously heavy. Each bar had markings stamped into the surface, 1 kilos, a year, 1978, and underneath initials, R.H. Raymond Hanley. Uncle Ray. Wes picked up one of the bars. The weight of it felt surreal, solid and valuable in a way that made his breath catch. He'd seen gold before, of course, but never held this much of it. Never imagined holding this much of it. 3 bars. 1 kilogram each. He did the rough math in his head. Gold prices had been climbing for years, and at current rates, each of these bars was worth maybe $60,000. That meant he was holding close to $180,000 in his hands. He sat back on his heels, staring at the gold, then at Clyde, then at the hole in the ground. The donkey was watching him with an expression that, if Wes was being fanciful, looked like patience. Questions poured through his mind in a flood. Where had Uncle Ray gotten this gold? Why had he buried it instead of putting it in a bank? How had Clyde known exactly where to dig? And most importantly, was there more? Wes looked around the orchard with new eyes. There were at least 40 or 50 dead apple trees scattered across maybe 3 acres. This spot Clyde had chosen seemed random, no markers or distinguishing features. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never find it. But Clyde had known. Wes rewrapped the gold bars carefully in their oilcloth and placed them back in the case. He carried it to the house, aware of the weight in more ways than one. This changed everything. This transformed his inheritance from a burden into something else entirely. But it also raised troubling questions about Uncle Ray's past. Inside the house, Wes found a place to hide the case, behind a loose board in the bedroom closet. It wasn't perfect, but it would do until he figured out what came next. Should he report this? Take it to authorities? Keep quiet and try to understand what Ray had been involved in? His uncle's letter came back to him. There are things buried on that land, Wes. Not treasure exactly, but history. Our history. This was what Ray had meant. The gold was part of that history, whatever it was. Wes spent the next hour searching the house more carefully than he had the night before. Uncle Ray's bedroom was sparse. A single bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a lamp. But when Wes examined the closet more carefully, he found a hidden compartment built into the wall behind the hanging clothes. It wasn't sophisticated, just a section of paneling that lifted away to reveal a shallow space. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the kind accountants might have used decades ago before computers took over. Wes pulled it out and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with Ray's handwriting, cramped and precise. Dates going back to the mid-1970s, entries that looked like coordinates or grid references. Cryptic notes: Orchard 3B 2 deep, eastern fence line, marker stone 3 feet, barn foundation, northeast corner. Numbers scattered throughout that might have been measurements or quantities or something else entirely. On one page, Ray had sketched a rough map of the property. The house was marked at the top, the barn to the side, and the orchard shown as a grid of small X marks. Some of the X marks had been circled. Others had notes beside them. Wes realized what he was looking at, a treasure map. His uncle had buried multiple caches across the property and documented them in this ledger. The codes and coordinates were Ray's way of keeping track of where everything was hidden. But why? Why bury wealth instead of using it? Why leave it all behind? He returned to the orchard, ledger in hand, and tried to match the entries to actual locations. The spot where Clyde had dug corresponded to one of the circled X marks on Ray's map, marked with the notation 3B confirmed. According to the ledger, there were at least 12 or 15 other potential locations marked across the property. Wes looked at Clyde, who had wandered over and was watching him with that patient, knowing expression. He taught you, didn't he? Ray taught you where to find them. The donkey's ears swiveled forward, and Wes could have sworn the animal nodded. It seemed impossible, but what else explained Clyde's behavior? Uncle Ray had been out here alone for years, getting older, maybe worrying about what would happen to his hidden fortune. Teaching a donkey to find the caches seemed crazy, but Ray had clearly been a methodical, careful man. Maybe it wasn't so crazy after all. "All right, Clyde," Wes said quietly. "Show me." The donkey turned and walked deeper into the orchard, moving with purpose now. Wes followed, carrying the ledger and feeling like he'd stepped into some kind of surreal dream. Clyde stopped at another tree, this one near the center of the orchard, and began pawing at the ground. Wes got the shovel. 2 feet down, he found another case. This one contained 2 more gold bars. By midday, working together, man and donkey in an unlikely partnership, they'd uncovered 2 more caches. The count was up to 9 bars total, worth roughly $540,000. Wes sat in the shade of the barn, surrounded by the evidence of his uncle's secret life, and tried to make sense of it all. Clyde stood nearby, patient as always, as if waiting for Wes to catch up to something the donkey had known all along. This wasn't just inheritance. This was legacy. This was Uncle Ray's final gift and final mystery, left in the care of a half-blind donkey who somehow understood exactly what was needed. Wes looked at the ledger, at the gold, at the property stretching out around him. Whatever Ray had been involved in, wherever this gold had come from, Wes now had a decision to make. Walk away and report it, keep quiet and take it, or stay and try to understand the full story. In the distance, Clyde huffed softly, as if the answer should be obvious. Maybe it was. Jesse carried the trunk into the house as darkness settled over the homestead. He set it down in the living room, made a pot of strong coffee, and settled into his grandfather's worn armchair with the journal in his lap and the letters spread across the coffee table. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames, but Jesse barely noticed. He was already lost in another time, another world. The letters from Elena painted a picture of a woman who was smart, passionate, and deeply in love. She wrote about her work at her father's garage in town, how she kept the books and sometimes helped with repairs when they were short-handed. She wrote about the local news, who was getting married, who was having babies, which ranches were struggling and which were thriving. She wrote about the future she and William were planning, the life they would build together when he came home. "I've been looking at properties," one letter from January 1953 read. "Nothing fancy, just a small place where we can start. Papa says he'll help us with the down payment if we need it. Carlos isn't too happy about me leaving, but he'll come around. He always does. He's just protective, you know how brothers are. He thinks no one is good enough for his little sister, not even you, and you're the best man I know." Jesse read that line twice, feeling the warmth and certainty in her words. Elena had been sure of William, had trusted him completely, and he'd been equally devoted to her if his journal entries were any indication. As Jesse read through the correspondence, a timeline emerged. William and Elena had known each other since childhood, had grown up in the same small Wyoming town, but their romance hadn't blossomed until William was 20 and Elena was 18. They'd courted for a year, made plans, talked about marriage. And then the Korean War had escalated, and William had enlisted, determined to serve his country, but equally determined to return to the woman he loved. The letters covered 2 years of separation, from March 1951 to June 1953. Elena's letters came regularly at first, 2 or 3 a week, sometimes more. They were full of life and hope and the kind of devotion that made Jesse's chest ache. His own marriage to Sarah had never had this quality, this absolute certainty. They'd loved each other, sure, but there had always been reservations, hesitations. Maybe that's why it had failed. William's letters to Elena were in the trunk too, returned to him after her death. Jesse read them with a growing sense of grief for the young man his grandfather had been. William wrote about the war, but more often he wrote about the future, about the ranch he wanted to build, the family he wanted to raise, the life he wanted to share with Elena. Every letter ended the same way, counting the days until I'm home. "All my love, William." But as Jesse progressed through the stack, he noticed something. Elena's letters stopped abruptly in May 1953. The last one was dated May 28th, cheerful and full of anticipation. "Only 2 more weeks until you're home," she wrote. "I can hardly believe it. I keep looking at the calendar, crossing off days like a schoolgirl. Carlos says I'm impossible to live with, but I don't care. Soon you'll be here, and nothing else will matter. I have so much to tell you, my darling. Things that will change everything in the most wonderful way. But I want to tell you in person, when I can see your face and hold your hands. 2 more weeks. I love you more than words can say." That was the last letter. After that, nothing. And Jesse knew why. 2 weeks later, Elena had died in the car accident. She'd never gotten to tell William whatever news she'd been saving. He'd never gotten the chance to come home to her, to marry her, to build the life they'd planned. Jesse set the letters aside and picked up the journal again, reading the entries after William returned from Korea. The devastation in the words was almost unbearable. William wrote about the funeral he'd missed by days, about Elena's family's grief, about Carlos Martinez's rage and blame. He wrote about standing at her grave, alone, with no one to comfort him, because everyone was too consumed by their own sorrow to notice his. And then, gradually, the entries began to mention Dorothy, Elena's best friend, a woman who had loved William quietly from the sidelines, who had helped him through the darkest period of his life. The journal entries about Dorothy were different, tender but not passionate, grateful but not ecstatic. William had married her a year after Eleanor's death, and the journal suggested it was a marriage born of practicality and companionship rather than the kind of love he'd felt for Elena. Dorothy is a good woman. One entry from 1954 read, "She deserves better than what I can give her, but she says she's content with what we have. She knows about Elena, knows I'll always carry that loss. She doesn't ask me to forget, doesn't ask me to love her the way I loved Elena. She just asks me to try. And I am trying. God knows I'm trying." Jesse thought about his grandmother, about the warm, kind woman who had baked pies and told stories and made the house feel like home. Had she been happy? Had she resented living in Elena's shadow? Or had she found a different kind of fulfillment in the life she'd built with William? The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, pulling Jesse out of the past. He'd been reading for hours, his coffee long since gone cold. His eyes burned with fatigue, but his mind was racing. So many questions and no one left to answer them. Who was Carlos Martinez? Was he still alive? And what about the rest of Elena's family? Had they stayed in town or had they left after her death? What was the important news Elena had wanted to share? The journal suggested it was something significant, something that would have changed everything. But William had never found out what it was, and now neither would Jesse, unless there were clues somewhere in the remaining letters. Jesse gathered the letters and journal, placing them carefully back in the trunk. He needed sleep, but more than that, he needed information. In the morning he would go into town, to the Historical Society or the library, anywhere that might have records from the 1950s. He would find out what happened to Elena Martinez and her family. He would piece together the full story of his grandfather's lost love. As he climbed the stairs to his old bedroom, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw Sarah's name on the screen. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. It was late and he wasn't sure he could have a coherent conversation after everything he'd just learned. But something made him answer. "Jesse?" Sarah's voice was soft, concerned. "I'm sorry to call so late. I wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay." Jesse sank down onto the top step, suddenly exhausted. "I'm at the homestead. Went through some of Granddad's things. How are you holding up?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "I found some stuff tonight about my grandfather. And things I never knew." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sarah had always been good at reading him, at knowing when to push and when to just listen. "You want to talk about it?" Jesse thought about the trunk downstairs, about Elena and William, and all those years of secret grief. "Not yet. Maybe soon. I need to figure some things out first." "Okay," Sarah said. "But Jesse, don't disappear into this. Whatever you found, whatever you're dealing with, don't shut everyone out. That's what you always do. You find something hard, and you go inside yourself and no one can reach you." He closed his eyes, knowing she was right. It was exactly what he was doing. "I'll try not to." "Good. And if you need anything, if you need someone to talk to, or just someone to sit with you while you figure things out, I'm here. We might not be married anymore, but I still care about you. I know." "Thank you, Sarah." After they hung up, Jesse sat on the stairs for a long time, thinking about Elena and William, about Dorothy and Sarah, about love and loss and the ways people try to move forward when their hearts have been broken. His grandfather had carried his grief in silence for 50 years, never burdening anyone else with it, never speaking Elena's name aloud. That kind of strength took a toll. Jesse could see it now in every memory he had of the old man. The quiet reserve, the emotional distance, the sense that part of him was always somewhere else, unreachable. Jesse didn't want to become that. He didn't want to spend his life locked away from connection, from vulnerability, from the risk of loving and losing again. But he didn't know how to avoid it either. The pattern was already set, the damage already done. He thought about Sarah's words, "Don't shut everyone out." Maybe that was the lesson his grandfather had left for him, hidden in the trunk, alongside the letters and photographs. Not just the story of a great love lost, but a warning about what happens when you lock that loss away and never let anyone help you carry it. Jesse pulled himself to his feet and went to bed, knowing sleep would be difficult but necessary. Tomorrow he would start looking for answers, and maybe, if he was lucky, he'd find more than just information about Elena Martinez. Maybe he'd find a way to understand his grandfather, and in understanding him, find a way to avoid making the same mistakes. Jesse drove into town the next morning with the sun barely above the horizon, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and the names Elena Martinez and Carlos Martinez written on a notepad on the passenger seat. The town hadn't changed much since his childhood. Main Street still had the same storefronts, the same grain elevator visible from miles away, the same sense of time moving slower here than in the rest of the world. The Historical Society occupied a small building next to the library, a former bank that had been converted into a repository for local history. Jesse had been here once as a kid on a school field trip, but he'd paid more attention to the old farming equipment than the dusty records and photographs on the walls. Now, as he pushed through the door, a small bell announced his arrival. The interior smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Glass display cases held collections of arrowheads, antique tools, and yellowed newspapers under protective covers. A woman emerged from a back room, elderly and petite, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. "Good morning," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret Chen. Can I help you find something?" "I hope so," Jesse said. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived here in the 1950s. Her name was Elena Martinez." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted, something flickering across her face. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Elena Martinez," she repeated softly. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a very long time. What's your interest in her, if you don't mind my asking?" "My grandfather knew her. William Cutter. I'm his grandson, Jesse." Understanding dawned in Mrs. Chen's eyes, and with it a sadness that seemed to age her further. "Bill Cutter's grandson, of course. I heard about Bill's passing. I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man." "Thank you. I found some letters and photographs at his place. Letters between him and Elena. I never knew about her, and I'm trying to understand what happened." Mrs. Chen gestured toward a small reading table near the window. "Sit down, young man. This is going to take some time." Jesse sat, and Mrs. Chen settled into the chair across from him, folding her hands on the table. "I was young when it happened, just a girl, really, but I remember it clearly. Everyone in town does, even those of us who were children at the time. Tragedies like that leave marks on a community. What happened exactly?" "Elena died in a car accident in June of 1953. It was 2 weeks before Bill was supposed to come home from Korea." Mrs. Chen's voice was gentle but matter-of-fact, the tone of someone who'd learned to speak difficult truths with kindness. She was driving on Highway 789, heading back from Casper, where she'd gone to do some shopping. They said she lost control of the vehicle. The car went off the road and rolled. She was killed instantly. Jesse felt the weight of those words, even though he'd already known the basic facts from the journal. Hearing it from someone who'd been there, who remembered, made it more real somehow. "My grandfather must have been devastated." "He was," Mrs. Chen said, "though I was too young to understand it fully at the time. But I remember people talking about it, about how Bill came home to find Elena already buried. Her family, her father and her brother Carlos, they were beside themselves with grief. And then Bill shows up, and it was like the whole town was holding its breath, wondering what would happen. The journal mentioned Carlos blamed my grandfather." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Carlos took it hard. He was protective of Elena, and I think in his grief he needed someone to blame. The way he saw it, Elena had been waiting for Bill, counting down the days, and maybe that made her distracted, made her not pay attention to her driving. It wasn't rational, but grief rarely is. Carlos and Bill got into a terrible argument at the funeral. After that, Carlos wanted nothing to do with him. Jesse absorbed this, imagining the scene, two young men united by their love for the same woman, torn apart by her death and their own inability to process the loss. "There's something else I need to tell you," Mrs. Chen said, her voice dropping lower. "Something that not everyone knew at the time, though there were rumors. Elena was pregnant when she died." The words hung in the air between them. Jesse felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Pregnant, the important news Elena had mentioned in her last letter. The thing that would have changed everything. My grandfather, did he know? Not before she died. The coroner's report mentioned it, of course, but the family tried to keep it quiet. This was 1953, and there was still a stigma about such things, even though she and Bill were engaged to be married. Carlos especially wanted it kept private, to protect Elena's reputation. But word got around eventually, the way it always does in small towns. Jesse's mind raced. His grandfather had lost not just the woman he loved, but a child he'd never known about. The weight of that loss was almost unbearable to contemplate. No wonder William had locked those memories away, had never spoken of Elena to anyone. What happened to her family? Jesse asked. Mrs. Chen stood and moved to a filing cabinet against the wall. She pulled open a drawer and extracted a manila folder, bringing it back to the table. "I took the liberty of pulling this when you mentioned Elena's name. We keep newspaper archives here, and I remembered there were articles about the accident and the aftermath." She spread several yellowed newspapers on the table. Jesse saw the headlines: "Local woman killed in highway accident. Community mourns Elena Martinez," and others. The articles provided details about the accident, about the funeral, about Elena's life in town. One mentioned her father's garage, another her volunteer work at the church. "The Martinez family left town about 3 months after Elena's death," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to a small article from September 1953. "Her father sold the garage and moved away. Carlos went with him. No one knew where they went, and they never came back. Some people said they went to New Mexico, where they had relatives. Others said Texas, but nobody knew for certain." Jesse studied the photographs accompanying the articles. Elena was even more beautiful in these professional shots than in the personal photos from the trunk. In one picture, she stood next to a man who had to be her brother. Same dark hair, same strong features but with harder edges, and more guarded expression. "Carlos," Jesse said, pointing to the photograph. "That's him. He'd be in his 90s now if he's still alive. And my grandmother, Dorothy." The journal mentioned she was Elena's friend. Mrs. Chen's expression softened. "Dorothy was a lovely woman. She and Elena were very close, best friends since childhood. Dorothy helped Elena's family after the accident, and she was the one who helped Bill through his grief. They married about a year later. Some people gossiped about it, said it wasn't appropriate, but Dorothy never paid attention to small-minded talk. She knew Bill needed someone, and she'd always cared for him, even when he only had eyes for Elena." Jesse thought about his grandmother, about the quiet strength she must have possessed to marry a man she knew was still in love with someone else, to build a life knowing she would always be second in his heart. She'd done it anyway, out of love, out of compassion, out of the belief that something good could still be salvaged from tragedy. Did my grandmother know about the pregnancy? I believe so. Dorothy was Elena's closest friend. If anyone knew, it would have been her. But she never spoke of it, never betrayed that confidence. Even after Elena was gone, Jesse gathered the newspapers carefully, studying each photograph, each detail. Mrs. Chen made copies for him at no charge, including several pictures from the Historical Society's own collection. As Jesse prepared to leave, she placed a hand on his arm. "Your grandfather lived with that loss every day of his life," she said. "But he found a way to keep going, to build something good with Dorothy, to be a father and a grandfather. That took courage. Don't judge him too harshly for keeping it private. Some wounds are too deep to expose to the world." "I'm not judging him," Jesse said. I'm trying to understand him, maybe for the first time. That's a good thing. Understanding is the first step toward forgiveness of others and ourselves. Jesse drove back to the homestead with the copies spread on the passenger seat beside him, his mind full of new information and old questions. His grandfather had lost everything that mattered to him in the span of a single moment: his love, his unborn child, his future. And he'd carried that knowledge in silence, had never burdened anyone else with the full weight of his grief. The heroism in that, the sheer strength required to wake up every day and keep living, keep working, keep being present for the people who needed him. Jesse was only beginning to grasp the magnitude of it. His grandfather hadn't been perfect, hadn't given Jesse everything he needed emotionally, but he'd been dealing with his own damage, his own loss. As Jesse pulled into the driveway, he saw Miguel's truck still parked near the barn. The old ranch hand was sitting on the porch waiting. Jesse climbed out and walked over, the folder of newspaper copies tucked under his arm. "Find what you were looking for?" Miguel asked. "Some of it. Enough to understand a little more." Miguel nodded, as if he'd expected as much. "Bill was carrying a heavy load, Jesse, heavier than most people could handle. But he handled it. That's what men of his generation did. They bore their burdens and didn't complain. Did you know about Elena?" "I knew there was someone before Dorothy. Bill never said her name, never told me the story. But I could see it in him sometimes, a distance, a sadness that had nothing to do with the present. A man doesn't look like that unless he's lost something important." Jesse sat down on the porch steps, looking out at the land his grandfather had worked for 50 years. "Her family left town after she died. Went to New Mexico, maybe. I want to find them, or their descendants at least. I think Granddad would have wanted that. Maybe he would have. Or maybe he put all this away for a reason, Jesse. You need to think carefully about stirring up old pain, for yourself and for others. I know. But I can't let it go. Not yet." Miguel stood, stretching his back. "Then you do what you need to do. Just remember, sometimes the answers we find aren't the ones we were hoping for." The house felt different now that Jesse knew its secrets, as if the walls themselves were holding memories he could almost touch. He spent the afternoon on the living room floor, surrounded by the contents of the trunk, organizing everything chronologically, trying to piece together a complete picture of his grandfather's life before and after Elena's death. The journal entries from the months immediately following William's return from Korea were the hardest to read. The handwriting deteriorated, becoming looser, more erratic, as if the simple act of forming letters required energy William didn't have. The entries were brief, often just a few sentences, but they carried the weight of unbearable grief. "Went to her grave today. Couldn't stay long. Couldn't breathe. Carlos won't see me. Sent me away. Says I killed her with my promises. Dorothy brought food. Can't eat. Can't do anything. Don't know why I'm still here." Jesse had to put the journal down several times, the pain in those words too raw, even 70 years later. This was what real grief looked like, stripped of pretense or performance. His grandfather had been drowning, barely surviving each day, held together only by the thinnest thread of obligation to keep breathing. Among the photographs, Jesse found one he'd missed the night before. It had been tucked between two letters, easy to overlook. The photo showed 3 people sitting on the tailgate of an old pickup truck, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera with the easy affection of lifelong friends. Jesse recognized his grandfather immediately, young and lean, maybe 19 or 20. Next to him was Elena, vibrant and alive, her head tilted toward William's shoulder. And on her other side was a young man who had to be Carlos Martinez, same dark coloring as Eleanor, same strong jawline, but with an intensity in his eyes that even the old photograph couldn't diminish. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, the 3 Musketeers, summer 1950. Nothing will ever change this, but everything had changed. War and death and grief had shattered that friendship, had turned Carlos's affection into blame, had left William alone with his loss, and no one who truly understood it. Jesse continued through the journal, watching as the weeks turned to months. Dorothy's name appeared more frequently. She brought meals. She sat with William on the porch. She helped him with ranch work when he couldn't manage alone. The entries about her were different in tone, grateful but distant, as if William was documenting acts of kindness from a stranger rather than someone he cared about. Then, tucked between the pages of the journal like a bookmark, Jessie found a folded piece of paper. It was different from the other letters, written on simple, lined notebook paper in neat, measured handwriting. The ink had faded to a soft grey, but the words were still legible. "My dearest William," it began, and Jessie recognized immediately that this was Dorothy's handwriting. He'd seen it on birthday cards and Christmas letters throughout his childhood. "I'm writing this knowing you may never read it, or if you do, it might not be for many years. But I need to say these things, even if only to paper. Even if you never know, I loved you long before you loved Elena. I was 14 years old when I realized you were different from the other boys in town, that you were kind and strong and decent in ways that mattered. I never said anything, because by the time I understood my own heart, yours already belonged to her. And I was happy for you both, truly. Elena was my dearest friend, and you made her so happy. That was enough for me. When she died, I grieved for her, but I also grieved for you, watching you suffer and not being able to ease that pain. I knew you would never love me the way you loved her. I knew I would always be second best, if that. But William, I also knew that you needed someone, and that I would rather spend my life loving you quietly than watch you destroy yourself with grief. When you asked me to marry you, I said yes, knowing exactly what I was agreeing to. I don't expect passion or romance. I don't expect you to forget Elena or to pretend she never existed. I only ask that you let me stand beside you, let me be your partner in building whatever life we can manage. I'll take whatever pieces of your heart you can spare, and I'll be grateful for them. I promise. I'll never ask you to explain your sadness or justify your distance. I'll never demand what you can't give. But I'll be here, William. For as long as you need me, I'll be here. With all my heart, Dorothy. Jessie read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of Dorothy's character. His grandmother had walked into that marriage with her eyes wide open, accepting terms that most people would have found unacceptable. She'd loved William enough to take whatever he could offer, to build a life on the foundation of his loss and her quiet devotion. He thought about his own marriage, about Sarah, and how different it had been. They'd married young, full of hope and possibility, but Jessie had never been fully present. There was always a part of him held back, always a distance he couldn't quite bridge. Sarah had spent 5 years trying to reach him, trying to break through whatever wall he'd built around himself, until finally she'd given up. "You're like a ghost," she'd told him during their last real conversation, before the lawyers and the paperwork. "You're physically here, but emotionally you're somewhere else. I can't compete with whatever you're running from, Jessie. I don't even know what it is, and I don't think you do either." She'd been right. He had been running from commitment, from vulnerability, from the risk of loving someone completely and losing them. And now, reading his grandmother's letter, seeing how she'd chosen to love anyway, despite the odds, Jessie felt something shift inside him. Dorothy had been braver than he'd ever given her credit for. She'd walked into a difficult situation and made the best of it, had built a good life despite the limitations. What was his excuse? He hadn't lost anyone, hadn't experienced the kind of trauma that had shaped his grandfather's life. He'd just been afraid, and he'd let that fear cost him the best relationship he'd ever had. Jessie carefully folded Dorothy's letter and placed it back in the journal. He thought about calling Sarah, about trying to explain what he was learning, but he wasn't ready yet. He needed to understand the full story first, needed to see how it all ended before he could apply the lessons to his own life. The rest of the journal entries documented William and Dorothy's life together. They married in a small ceremony in the summer of 1954. They built the ranch up slowly, working side by side, finding a rhythm that suited them both. The entries about Dorothy were never passionate, but they were warm, appreciative. William documented her kindnesses, her strength, her patience with his moods and silences. Dorothy made apple pie today, one entry from 1956 read. She remembers Elena used to make it the same way. She never says it, but I know she's trying to give me small pieces of what I lost. I don't deserve her kindness, but I'm grateful for it. And later in 1958, after Jesse's father was born, held my son today. Dorothy says he has my eyes. All I can think about is that Elena should have been here to see this. Her child should have lived. Sometimes I think about what might have been, and it hurts so much I can't breathe. But then I look at Dorothy, at what she's given me, and I remember I have to keep going. For her, for our son, even when it feels impossible. Jesse understood now why his grandfather had seemed distant, why there'd always been a sadness in him that Jesse couldn't name as a child. William had been living with loss every single day, carrying the memory of Elena and their unborn child, while trying to be present for the family he'd built with Dorothy. It was a balancing act that must have required enormous strength, and most days he'd probably felt like he was failing at both. The parallels to Jesse's own life were impossible to ignore. He'd been emotionally unavailable to Sarah, had held pieces of himself back without even understanding why. Was it inherited, this tendency toward distance? Or had he simply learned it from watching his grandfather, from absorbing the lesson that keeping your heart guarded was safer than risking it completely? Jesse closed the journal and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Miguel was right that some answers weren't comfortable, but they were necessary. Understanding his grandfather meant understanding himself, and maybe, just maybe, finding a way to do better. Outside, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jesse had been at the homestead for 2 days now, and he felt like he'd lived a lifetime in that span. Everything he'd thought he knew about his family, about himself, had been called into question. And there were still more answers to find, more pieces of the puzzle to uncover. He thought about Carlos Martinez, about Elena's family, who had disappeared into New Mexico or Texas or wherever grief had taken them. He thought about the important news Elena had wanted to share, the child she'd been carrying when she died. That child was Jesse's grandfather's son or daughter, family that William had never known about, but Mrs. Chen had said Elena was pregnant when she died. That meant the baby had died too, didn't it? Or had Jesse misunderstood? He pulled out the newspaper copies and read through them again, looking for details about the accident. The articles mentioned Elena's death, but were vague about specifics. Nothing about a pregnancy, nothing about a baby. Jesse made a mental note to call Mrs. Chen in the morning to clarify exactly what had happened. Because if there was any chance, any possibility that Elena's child had survived, that changed everything. That meant his grandfather might have had another child out there somewhere, might have had family he'd never known about. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. Jesse wasn't sure he was ready for what he might find. But he knew he couldn't stop looking now. He'd opened this door, and he had to see what was on the other side, no matter what it cost him. Jesse woke early the next morning, after a restless night filled with dreams of people he'd never met. Elena and Carlos, young and alive, laughing in the Wyoming sunshine before tragedy found them. He made coffee and returned to the trunk, determined to go through everything methodically, looking for any detail he might have missed. Near the bottom of the trunk, beneath a stack of old photographs, his fingers brushed against something stiff and official. He pulled it free and found himself holding a legal document, folded and yellowed with age. As he unfolded it, he saw it was a property deed dated September 1954 for 15 acres of land in Tres Piedras, New Mexico. The deed was in his grandfather's name. William Cutter had purchased land in New Mexico the year after Elena died, and he'd never mentioned it to anyone. Jesse read through the legal language carefully, noting the property description, the purchase price, the county records information. But what struck him most was a notation at the bottom, handwritten in his grandfather's script for the Martinez family. "What I owe them." Jesse's hands trembled slightly as he set the deed aside and dug deeper into the trunk. There had to be more information, more explanation, and there was. Tucked into an envelope were bank statements, dozens of them, dating from 1954 through 2010. Each one showed a monthly wire transfer to an account in New Mexico, amounts varying from $50 to $200, depending on the year and presumably William's financial situation. For 56 years, his grandfather had been sending money to someone in New Mexico. The account holder's name was listed simply as Martinez Trust. Jesse did the math in his head, even at modest amounts. William had sent thousands of dollars over the decades, money he'd earned through hard work and careful saving, money that could have made his own life easier, but which he'd chosen to send elsewhere. Jesse returned to the journal, flipping to the entries from 1954. He found what he was looking for in an entry dated August 15th. Found out where Elena's family went. Maria, Elena's aunt, settled in Tres Piedras with her husband. Now Carlos and Elena's father went with her. They're trying to start over, but I know they're struggling. Manuel sold the garage for almost nothing, was desperate to leave town, and didn't negotiate well. I can't give Elena back to them. I can't undo what happened, but I can do this. I can help them financially, even if they never know it's from me. Bought property near their place. Put it in my name, but had my lawyer draw up papers making it a trust for any Martinez descendants. When I die, it'll go to them. It's not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. But it's something. Jesse sat back, overwhelmed by the revelation. His grandfather hadn't just grieved and moved on. He'd tracked down Elena's family, had found a way to help them from a distance, respecting Carlos's wish to have nothing to do with him while still trying to make amends for a tragedy that wasn't his fault. More journal entries followed, documenting William's attempts to reach out to Carlos directly. He'd written letters that went unanswered, had tried to visit once and been turned away. Carlos's grief had hardened into anger, and that anger needed a target. William had accepted that role, had absorbed the blame without defending himself because he understood that grief made people irrational. Carlos won't see reason, an entry from 1955 read. Stood on his porch yesterday, told me to leave and never come back. Said Elena died because she was too distracted, waiting for me to notice the truck that hit her. Maybe he's right. Maybe if I'd never gone to war, if we'd married before I enlisted, she'd still be alive. I'll carry that question for the rest of my life. Jesse thought about the photograph of the three friends, arms around each other, smiling. War and loss had destroyed that bond completely, had left William isolated with his guilt and Carlos consumed by blame. Neither man had been able to find a way back to friendship, to the easy companionship they'd once shared. The bank statements continued through the years, a paper trail of quiet penance. William had never stopped sending money, even in years when Jesse knew the ranch had struggled, even when medical bills for Dorothy mounted and finances grew tight. The transfers went out like clockwork, a promise kept in silence. Jesse checked the last statement in the stack, dated October 2010, just a few years before his grandfather's death. The monthly transfers had stopped then, probably when William's finances finally couldn't support them anymore. But for more than 5 decades, he'd honored his commitment to Elena's family, had done what he could to ease their burden from afar. The magnitude of his grandfather's sacrifice was staggering. William had built a life with Dorothy, had raised a son, had worked the ranch day after day, all while carrying this secret obligation, this self-imposed penance for a tragedy he hadn't caused. No one had known, not Dorothy, not Jesse's father, not anyone. William had carried this alone. Just as he'd carried his grief, Jesse heard a vehicle pull into the driveway and looked out the window to see a familiar silver Honda Civic parking next to his truck. Sarah. She climbed out, hesitant, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that made her look younger than her 30 years. Jesse met her at the door before she could knock. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" "I was worried about you," she said. "You sounded, I don't know, lost on the phone the other night. I thought maybe you could use some company. Or at least someone to make sure you're eating something besides cold coffee and determination." Despite everything, Jesse smiled. "That's pretty accurate, actually." She studied his face. And he knew she was cataloging the signs. the shadows under his eyes, the stubble, the way his shoulders carried tension like a physical weight. She'd always been able to read him even when he didn't want to be read. "Can I come in?" Jessie stepped aside and she entered the house. Her eyes went immediately to the trunk, and its contents spread across the floor, the letters, the photographs, the journal, the deed and bank statements. She took it all in without speaking, then looked at him with questions in her eyes. "It's a long story," Jessie said. "I've got time." So he told her. About finding the key, about Elena and William's love story cut short by tragedy, about Carlos's blame and Dorothy's quiet devotion, about the property in New Mexico, and the decades of anonymous financial support. Sarah listened without interrupting, sitting cross-legged on the floor, occasionally picking up a photograph to look at more closely. When Jessie finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather was trying to save them. From poverty, from struggle, from anything he could protect them from. Because he couldn't save Elena, he blamed himself for her death, for all of it, but it wasn't his fault. Accidents happen. He couldn't have known, couldn't have prevented it. I know that. But he didn't. Or maybe he did intellectually, but it didn't matter. The guilt was there regardless." Jessie picked up Dorothy's letter, handling it carefully. "My grandmother knew. She had to have known, at least about some of it. But she stayed with him anyway, loved him anyway." Sarah read the letter when Jessie handed it to her, and he saw tears form in her eyes. "She was braver than most people could be. She was. And I never understood that when she was alive. I just saw her as grandma, you know, someone who made pies and told stories. I didn't see the depth of what she'd chosen. Are you going to try to find them?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the deed. "Elena's family? I have to. Granddad left this for someone to find eventually. He wanted someone to know, to finish what he started. The deed says it goes to Martinez descendants. I need to find out if any exist, and if they do, I need to give them what's rightfully theirs. That could be complicated, Jessie. It's been 70 years. People move, people die. The family might not even exist anymore. I know, but I have to try." Sarah nodded, understanding. This was who Jessie was. Once he committed to something, he saw it through. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, even when that commitment extended to everything except their marriage. "Okay," she said. "Then let's figure out how to find them. Where do we start? You think I drove 3 hours just to make sure you were eating? I'm here, Jessie. Let me help." He looked at her. His ex-wife, the woman he'd pushed away because he couldn't figure out how to let her in, and felt something unlock in his chest. Maybe he was learning, finally, what his grandfather never had. How to accept help. How to let someone stand beside him, instead of carrying everything alone. "Thank you," he said quietly. They spent the rest of the day researching. Sarah was better with computers than Jessie, and she quickly found property records for Tres Piedras, New Mexico, online. The land William had purchased was still in his name, held in trust according to the terms he'd specified with his lawyer decades ago. That meant it hadn't been claimed yet, which suggested the Martinez family either didn't know about it or couldn't be found. They searched for Martinez family members in New Mexico, finding dozens of possibilities, but no clear connections to Elena or Carlos. Birth records, death records, marriage certificates. The paper trail existed but was fragmented, incomplete. After several hours, they'd narrowed it down to a handful of potential leads, addresses and names that might connect back to the right family. "This is going to take more than internet research," Sarah said, leaning back and stretching. "You might need to go down there, talk to people in person, visit records offices. I know. I'm thinking about making the drive this week." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Want company?" The question hung between them, loaded with more meaning than the simple words conveyed. Jessie thought about saying no, about protecting both of them from the complications that might arise from spending that much time together. But then he thought about his grandfather, about William spending 50 years alone with his grief, never letting anyone fully in, not even Dorothy, who loved him despite everything. "Yeah," Jessie said. "I'd like that." They ordered pizza that evening, the first real meal Jessie had eaten since arriving at the homestead. As they sat at the kitchen table, eating from paper plates and drinking beer from his grandfather's refrigerator, Jesse felt a sense of normalcy he hadn't experienced in days. Sarah had always been good at this, at making difficult situations feel manageable, at bringing light into dark spaces. "Tell me honestly," Sarah said, wiping pizza grease from her fingers. "How are you really doing with all this? It's a lot to process." "I don't know," Jesse admitted. "Part of me wishes I'd never found that key. Life was simpler when I thought I knew who my grandfather was. But another part of me, the bigger part, is glad I know the truth. Even if it hurts. Truth usually does hurt," Sarah said. "But it's better than living with comfortable lies." After they finished eating, they returned to the trunk. There were still documents they hadn't examined thoroughly, papers tucked into the bottom that Jesse had only glanced at. Sarah pulled out a manila envelope that had been wedged against the side. "What's this?" she asked, opening it carefully. Inside were medical records, old and faded but still legible. Sarah spread them on the table, and Jesse leaned in to read over her shoulder. They were hospital documents from Casper Memorial Hospital, dated June 1953. His eyes scanned down the page, looking for anything relevant, and then he saw it. "A birth certificate, stamped and official." "Jesse," Sarah whispered, "look at this." The certificate was for a baby girl, born June 8, 1953. Mother's name, Elena Maria Martinez. Father's name, William James Cutter. Baby's name, Isabella Grace Martinez. Weight 6 pounds 4 ounces. The baby had been born healthy, full term, 3 days before Eleanor's accident. Jesse felt the world tilt sideways. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself, his breath coming short and fast. The baby hadn't died in the accident. The baby had survived. Elena had given birth, had held her daughter, had lived for 3 more days before the car crash took her life. "She survived," Jesse said, his voice barely audible. "My grandfather's daughter survived." Sarah was already pulling up the rest of the documents, her hands shaking with excitement and urgency. There was a hospital record showing Elena had been admitted in labor on June 7 and discharged on June 10 with a healthy infant. There was a notation in the margin. Patient expressed concern about father serving overseas. Family support in place via Sister Maria Martinez. Another document showed that custody of Isabella had been granted to Maria Martinez following Elena's death. The legal paperwork was brief but clear. With Elena gone and William unreachable in Korea, Maria had been appointed as the child's guardian. By the time William returned and learned about Elena's death, Isabella was already living with Maria, and Carlos had made it clear that William was not welcome in their lives. "Oh my God," Sarah said, reading through more papers. "Your grandfather had a daughter and never got to raise her. Never even got to meet her." Jesse thought about the journal entry where William had mentioned Elena wanting to tell him something important, something that would change everything. This was it. She'd been planning to tell him about the baby, about their daughter, but she'd wanted to wait until he was home, until she could see his face and hold his hands while she shared the news, and she'd never gotten the chance. "Keep looking," Jesse said, his heart pounding. "There has to be more. If Isabella was real, if she grew up, there has to be some record of what happened to her." They dug deeper, finding a collection of papers that looked different from the others, newer and more recent. These were documents William had compiled later in life, evidence of his own research into Isabella's fate. There were printouts from ancestry websites, copies of marriage licenses, birth certificates for Isabella's children. Isabella Grace Martinez had married a man named Roberto Delgado in 1972. They'd settled in Tres Piedras, New Mexico, on the very property William had purchased decades earlier. She'd had 3 children, Maria Elena Delgado, born 1973, Carlos William Delgado, born 1975, and Rosa Marie Delgado, born 1978. "He knew," Jesse said, staring at the papers. "Granddad knew about Isabella. He tracked her down, found out about her life, her children. These documents are from the early 2000s. He must have spent years researching, finding pieces of information, building this picture of the daughter he'd never met. Sarah pointed to another document, a death certificate for Isabella Martinez Delgado, dated March 2018. She died of cancer at 64 years old, survived by her 3 children and 5 grandchildren. "So your grandfather's daughter died 5 years ago," Sarah said softly. "But her children are still alive." "Jesse, you have cousins. Your grandfather had grandchildren he never knew about." The implications cascaded through Jesse's mind like dominoes falling. His grandfather had known about Isabella, had tracked her life from a distance, had seen her marry and have children and build a life. But Carlos's anger and the family's grief had kept them separated. William had never tried to contact her, had never claimed his paternal rights, had simply watched from afar and sent money to ensure she and her family were provided for. The property deed made sense now. William had bought land near where Isabella lived, had created a trust that would eventually pass to her and her descendants. It was his way of being a father when he couldn't actually be present, his way of providing for a child he'd never been allowed to know. "The land transfers to Martinez descendants when your grandfather dies," Sarah said, reading the trust documents. "That means Isabella's children, they're the rightful heirs. They probably have no idea this property exists." Jesse pulled up a search on his phone for Rosa Delgado in Tres Piedras, New Mexico. There were several listings, but one stood out. A Rosa M. Delgado, age 46, with an address on Camino de Elena, Elena's Road. "The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. That has to be her," Jesse said, showing Sarah the screen. "Isabella's youngest daughter. She's still in Tres Piedras. Are you going to contact her?" Jesse set the phone down, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd discovered. These people, Isabella's children and grandchildren, were his family. They shared his grandfather's blood, his legacy, his history. But they didn't know Jesse existed, didn't know about William beyond whatever stories Carlos and Maria had told them. Those stories probably weren't kind. "I don't know," Jesse admitted. "What do I say? I'm the grandson of the man who your family blamed for your grandmother's death. Here's some property he left you because he felt guilty for 50 years. Or," Sarah said gently, "you could tell them the truth, that your grandfather loved Elena, that he never knew about Isabella until it was too late, that he spent his entire life trying to make amends for a tragedy that wasn't his fault. You could give them the letters, let them see who William really was. Let them decide what to think about him." Jesse thought about the letters, about Elena's words of love and devotion, about William's grief and determination to provide for a daughter he'd never met. These weren't just documents. They were proof of a love story that had been interrupted but never forgotten. Proof that William had been a good man who'd made the best of impossible circumstances. "What if they don't want to know?" Jesse asked. "What if Carlos poisoned them against my grandfather, and they refused to hear anything good about him? And then at least you tried. At least you honored what your grandfather wanted." He'd left all this for someone to find, Jesse. He could have destroyed these papers, could have taken all of this to his grave. But he didn't. He kept everything, hid it carefully, and left a key where you would find it. He wanted this story told. He wanted his daughter's family to know the truth. Jesse picked up the photograph of the 3 friends, William, Elena, and Carlos, young and hopeful, before war and tragedy tore them apart. On the back, Elena had written, "Nothing will ever change this." But everything had changed. Death and grief had shattered that perfect moment, had sent everyone spiraling in different directions, alone with their pain. Maybe it was time to bring them back together, at least in memory. Maybe Isabella's children deserved to know that their grandfather had loved their grandmother fiercely, that he'd mourned her death every day of his life, that he'd provided for them from a distance because he wasn't allowed to do so in person. "I'll go to New Mexico," Jesse said. "I'll find Rosa Delgado. I'll tell her everything, about William and Elena, about Isabella, about the property. And I'll give her these documents, these letters, this journal. It's her family history as much as it's mine. She deserves to have it." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in years. "That's the right thing to do. And I meant what I said earlier. I'll go with you if you want the company. I do want it, Jessie said. I don't think I can do this alone. She reached across the table and took his hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything unsaid between them. They'd failed as a married couple, but maybe they could succeed as something else. Friends, partners in righting an old wrong. People who cared about each other even if romantic love hadn't been enough. They spent the next hour organizing everything they would need to bring to New Mexico. The journal, the letters, the photographs, the property deed, the trust documents, the bank statements showing William's decades of financial support. It was a complete record of a man's devotion, his grief, and his determination to do right by the people he'd loved and lost. As Jessie packed everything carefully into a box, he thought about Isabella, the daughter his grandfather had never met. The child born from a great love and raised by others. She'd lived her whole life not knowing William, but she'd benefited from his provision, had raised her own children on land he'd purchased for them, had built a life shaped by his quiet generosity, even if she'd never known its source. That was a kind of fatherhood too, Jessie realized. Not the ideal kind, not the kind anyone would choose, but a real and meaningful one nonetheless. William had done what he could with the circumstances he'd been given. He'd loved Isabella from a distance, had ensured she had what she needed to thrive, had watched over her family even though he couldn't be part of it. "When do you want to leave?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow morning," Jessie said. "First light. It's about an 8-hour drive. We can be there by evening, then we should get some sleep." It's going to be a long day, but Jessie doubted he would sleep. How could he, knowing what awaited him in New Mexico? A family he'd never met, a history that connected them across decades of silence, and the chance to finally complete what his grandfather had started. To bring Elena's story full circle, to honor William's devotion, and maybe, just maybe, to heal some of the wounds that had never properly closed. He thought about the rusted key, the simple piece of metal that had started all of this. His grandfather had hidden it in the saddle, knowing that someday someone would find it. Someone would unlock the shed, open the trunk, and discover the truth. William had left a trail of breadcrumbs for Jessie to follow, had trusted that when the time came, Jessie would do what needed to be done. Tomorrow, he would honor that trust. Tomorrow, he would drive to New Mexico and find Isabella's children and tell them about the grandfather they'd never known. Tomorrow, he would finally close the circle that had been broken 70 years ago when Elena died on a highway outside of Casper. But tonight, he sat in his grandfather's house with Sarah beside him, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had survived death, distance, and decades of silence. And for the first time since finding the key, Jessie felt at peace. He was doing what his grandfather had wanted. He was finishing the story. Jessie woke before dawn to find Sarah already awake, making coffee in the kitchen. She'd slept in his old bedroom upstairs, and he'd taken the couch, surrounded by the documents that would change everything for Isabella's family. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the percolator bubbling on the stove. "Couldn't sleep either?" Sarah asked as Jessie appeared in the doorway. "Too much on my mind." She poured him a cup, and they stood together watching the sun rise over the eastern pasture, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the kind of morning his grandfather would have loved, clear and crisp, full of promise. Jessie wished the old man was here to see it, to know what Jessie was about to do. "I should finish going through the trunk," Jessie said. "Make sure we have everything before we leave." They returned to the living room, and Jessie knelt beside the old steamer trunk one more time. He'd been so focused on the letters and journals that he hadn't examined every corner, every pocket. Now, running his hands along the interior, he felt something in a side compartment he'd missed before, a hidden pocket in the lining, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax, his name written across the front in his grandfather's handwriting. The ink looked recent, not decades old like the other documents. Jessie's hands trembled as he broke the seal and pulled out several pages of notebook paper covered in William's careful script. "My dear Jessie," it began. and Jesse had to blink back tears before he could continue reading. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I left for you. I'm writing this in the summer of 2018, and I know my time is short. The doctors give me maybe a year, though I think they're being optimistic. My heart is tired, son, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. I hid the key in my saddle, knowing you'd be the one to go through my things after I passed. Tom Brennan will try to spare you the burden, will tell you there's nothing of value to inherit, and he'll be right about the money and the land. But what I'm leaving you is more valuable than any of that. I'm leaving you the truth about who I was, about the life I lived before you knew me, about the choices I made and the losses I carried. By now, you've read Elena's letters. You've seen her photographs. You know that I loved her with everything I had, and that losing her broke something in me that never fully healed. What you might not know yet is that she had my child, our daughter Isabella. She was born 3 days before Elena died in that accident. I didn't find out about Isabella until I came home from Korea, and it was too late. Elena was already buried, and Carlos had made it clear I wasn't welcome in their lives. I respected that, even though it killed me. Carlos was right to be angry. I'd left Elena, had gone off to war, and while I was gone, she died. That's on me, even if the logic doesn't quite hold up. Grief doesn't care about logic. So I stayed away from Isabella. Let Maria raise her, let her grow up thinking her father had died in Korea, or didn't care, or whatever story they told her. I don't know what she was told. I never asked, but I watched over her from a distance. I bought property near where the family settled in New Mexico. I sent money every month for decades, anonymously, through lawyers who kept my secret. I made sure Isabella and her children would have something when I was gone. It's not the same as being a father, I know that. But it was all I could do given the circumstances. Now here's what I need from you, Jesse. I need you to find Isabella's children, my grandchildren who don't know I exist, and give them the property deed. Tell them about Elena, about how much I loved her, about how I would have raised Isabella if I'd been given the chance. Tell them I thought about them every day of my life, that I provided for them the only way I could, and that I'm sorry. Sorry for not being braver, for not fighting harder to be part of their lives, for letting Carlos's anger keep me away when maybe I should have pushed through it. I kept all these letters and documents because I wanted someone to know the truth. Dorothy knew most of it. She was Elena's best friend, after all, and she helped me through those dark years after I came home. She never judged me for loving Elena more than I could love her. She accepted what I could give and made a good life for us anyway. She was stronger than me, in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. Your father, my son, I never told him about any of this. Maybe I should have, but I couldn't find the words. By the time I thought I should tell him, he was gone too, killed in that damn logging accident when you were just a boy. So now it falls to you, Jesse. You're the last of our line, the last cutter man standing. And I'm asking you to do what I couldn't, to bridge the gap between our family and Elena's, to bring us together, even if it's too late for me to be part of it. But there's something else I need to tell you. And this is the real reason I'm writing this letter. I've watched you, Jesse, all these years, and I've seen myself in you. The way you keep people at arm's length. The way you left Sarah, even though I could see you loved her. The way you drift from place to place, never settling, never committing, always holding something back. You're doing what I did. You're protecting yourself from loss by never fully loving anything or anyone. And son, I need you to hear this. It doesn't work. I thought if I kept my distance, if I didn't love too deeply again after losing Elena, I could avoid that kind of pain. But what I learned is that you can't protect yourself from grief by refusing to love. You just end up lonely. Dorothy loved me, and I cared for her. But I never gave her everything I could have given. I held back, and that was cruel to her and damaging to me. Your father felt it too, I think. He knew I was distant, that there was a wall he couldn't get through. And now you're doing the same thing. Don't make my mistakes, Jesse. Don't spend your life running from connection because you're afraid of loss. Everyone loses people they love. That's part of being human. The question is whether you'll have loved fully and lived fully before that loss comes, or whether you'll have spent your whole life in a defensive crouch, protecting yourself from pain but also from joy. I see the way you look at Sarah. I saw it at Christmas, before you two argued and you left. You still love her, son, and I think she still loves you. Don't let pride or fear or whatever else you're carrying keep you from trying again. Life is too short. They learned that the hard way, and I don't want you to have to learn it the same way. Go to New Mexico. Find my grandchildren. Tell them about Elena and me. Give them the property that's rightfully theirs. And then come home and fix your own life. Talk to Sarah. Be honest about what you're afraid of and why you run. Give her a chance to understand you, and give yourself a chance to be understood. That's what I should have done with Dorothy, what I should have done with your father. I'm hoping you'll be smarter than I was. I love you, Jesse. I'm proud of the man you've become, even if I never said it enough when I was alive to say it. You're strong and decent and good. Now be brave too. Finish what I started, and then build something better for yourself than what I managed. Your grandfather, William Cutter. Jesse read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face by the end. His grandfather had known, had seen Jesse's patterns, had understood the walls he'd built, and had tried one last time to guide him towards something better. The trunk wasn't just about Elena and Isabella. It was about teaching Jesse how to live, how to love, how to be present and vulnerable and whole. Sarah had been reading over his shoulder, and when Jesse finally set the letter down, she was crying too. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, her head resting against his back, and they stayed like that for a long moment. 2 people who'd hurt each other trying to find their way back to connection. He was a wise man, Sarah said softly. He was, and he was right about me, about us. Jesse, let me finish, he said, turning to face her. I've been running from you, from us, since the day we met. I convinced myself it was about independence, about not being tied down, but it was really about being terrified. Terrified of needing you, of loving you so much that losing you would destroy me. So I kept my distance and I pushed you away, and I ruined the best thing I ever had. You didn't ruin it, Sarah said, wiping tears from her cheeks. We both had a hand in how things ended. But Jesse, you need to understand something. I can't go back to how we were. I can't be with someone who's always halfway out the door. I know, and I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking for a chance to show you I can do better. After we get back from New Mexico, after we finish this, let me prove I can be the person you deserved all along. Sarah studied his face, and he could see her weighing his words against past experience, against disappointment and heartbreak, and all the times he'd promised to change and hadn't. But he could also see hope there, fragile but real, the kind of hope that keeps people trying even when logic says they shouldn't. Okay, she said finally, we'll see. One day at a time. It wasn't a commitment, wasn't a promise that they'd get back together. But it was a door left open, a possibility where before there had been only finality. Jesse would take it. He'd take whatever chance she was willing to give him and do his damnedest not to waste it. They spent the next hour packing carefully. The journal, the letters, the photographs, the property deed, the trust documents, the bank statements, everything that told William and Elena's story. Jesse also packed his grandfather's military medals and uniform, thinking Isabella's children might want to know that William had served his country with honor. As they were loading everything into Jesse's truck, Miguel pulled up in his old Ford. He climbed out slowly, moving like a man who'd worked hard his whole life and was feeling it in his bones. Heading out, Miguel asked. Going to New Mexico, Jesse said, to find my grandfather's other family, the ones he couldn't acknowledge while he was alive. Miguel nodded, unsurprised. Bill told me about them once right before he died. Said he had grandchildren he'd never met, and he hoped someday someone would tell them he'd thought about them every day. Glad it's going to be you, Jesse. Did he say anything else? He said to tell you not to be stubborn like him. Said to let people in, even when it scares you. Said love was worth the risk, always. Miguel looked between Jesse and Sarah. Seems like maybe you're figuring that out. I'm trying. That's all anyone can do. Miguel shook Jesse's hand, then pulled him into a brief hug. You drive safe. And when you get back, we'll figure out what to do about this place. Maybe it doesn't have to be sold after all. Jesse thought about the homestead, about the life his grandfather had built here despite carrying such heavy grief. Maybe Miguel was right. Maybe some things were worth fighting to keep, worth building a future around. They left as the sun climbed higher, driving south toward New Mexico and whatever waited there. Sarah navigated while Jesse drove, following highways that cut through Wyoming's vast spaces and down into Colorado. They didn't talk much, both lost in their own thoughts. But it was a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from knowing someone deeply. As they crossed into New Mexico in the late afternoon, the landscape changed, mountains giving way to high desert, pine trees to piñon and juniper. The sky was enormous here, stretching from horizon to horizon in a dome of perfect blue. Jesse understood why his grandfather had bought property in this place. It was beautiful, in a stark, honest way that didn't apologize for itself. They reached Tres Piedras as the sun was setting, a small village that looked like it hadn't changed much since William had first visited in the 1950s. Adobe buildings, dusty streets, mountains rising in the distance like purple sentinels. Jesse pulled over and checked the address he'd found for Rosa Delgado. "It's on Camino de Elena," he said. "About 2 miles from here. Are you ready for this?" Jesse thought about his grandfather's letter, about the charge William had given him. "Finish what I started. Tell the truth. Bridge the gap." He thought about Elena and Isabella, about love and loss, and the ways people try to make amends across decades of silence. He thought about his own life, about the patterns he'd followed and the changes he needed to make. "No," he said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand. "Then let's go meet your family." The house sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a modest adobe structure with a covered porch and a garden that showed signs of careful tending. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, their soft music carrying across the evening air. Jesse pulled his truck to a stop and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. "You okay?" Sarah asked. "Just nervous." "What if she slams the door in my face? What if Carlos told them terrible things about my grandfather, and they don't want to hear the truth? Then we'll deal with it. But you won't know unless you try." Jesse climbed out, carrying the box of documents. Sarah walked beside him as they approached the front door. He could see lights on inside, hear the faint sound of a television. A normal evening in a normal household, about to be upended by a stranger bearing news of family they'd never met. He knocked. 3 solid raps that sounded too loud in the quiet evening. Footsteps approached, and the door opened to reveal a woman in her mid-60s, with dark hair shot through with silver and eyes that were startlingly familiar. Jesse felt a jolt of recognition. Those were his grandfather's eyes, the same grey-blue color, the same intensity. He was looking at family. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "Strangers showing up at dinner time probably weren't common out here. Are you Rosa Delgado?" Jesse asked. "I am." "Who's asking?" Jesse took a breath. "My name is Jesse Cutter. This is Sarah Whitmore. I know this is going to sound strange, but I'm here because of my grandfather, William Cutter. He knew your grandmother, Elena Martinez." Rosa's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and then something that might have been recognition. She looked at Jesse more carefully, studying his features, and he wondered what she saw. If she could see William in him, the way he'd seen him in her. "William Cutter," she repeated slowly. "You better come inside." She led them into a living room that was warm and lived in, with family photographs covering every available surface. Jesse saw pictures of children and grandchildren, of celebrations and ordinary moments, a life well lived and documented. Rosa gestured for them to sit on the couch while she settled into an armchair. "I haven't heard that name in years," Rosa said. "My Uncle Carlos used to mention him sometimes, usually when he'd had too much to drink." Never said anything kind. "But my mother, she had a different view." "Your mother was Isabella," Jesse said. "William Cutter's daughter. I know who my mother was." Rosa's voice was careful, controlled. "And yes, I know about William Cutter. My mother told me the story before she died. She passed away 2 years ago, cancer. But she made sure I knew about her biological father, about the circumstances of her birth, about everything. Jessie felt a weight lift slightly. Isabella had known. She hadn't spent her whole life thinking her father didn't care or didn't exist. She'd known the truth, or at least some version of it. What did she tell you? Jessie asked. Rosa was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to a bookshelf. She pulled down a large, leather-bound Bible, the kind families used to record births and deaths and marriages, and brought it back to her chair. She opened it carefully, revealing pressed flowers between the pages, old photographs and letters. My mother said her father was a soldier who loved her mother very much, Rosa began. She said he went to war and came home too late, that her grandmother died before he could return. She said her Uncle Carlos was angry and wouldn't let him be part of her life. But that didn't mean he didn't care. Rosa pulled out a photograph and handed it to Jessie. It showed Elena, young and smiling, with flowers in her hair. This was in my mother's things. And these, she pulled out several letters, are letters Elena wrote to William while he was in Korea. My mother kept them her whole life. Jessie took the letters with shaking hands. They were Elena's, written in her familiar script. Love letters his grandfather had somehow gotten to Isabella, perhaps through a lawyer or intermediary after Carlos died. William sent these to my mother in 1991, after Carlos passed away, Rosa explained. There was a note with them, saying he'd kept them for decades, but he wanted Isabella to have them, to know how much he'd loved Elena, that he would have raised her if he'd been allowed, that he'd provided for her the only way he could. Did she ever try to contact him? Sarah asked gently. She thought about it. But she was in her 30s by then, had her own family, and she was afraid. Afraid of rejection, afraid of disrupting his life, afraid of opening old wounds. So she kept the letters and the photographs and wondered about him from a distance. The same way, I suppose, he wondered about her. Jessie's throat was tight. Two people who should have known each other, who should have had a relationship, kept apart by pride and anger and fear, both wanting connection, but neither brave enough to reach for it. He thought about her every day, Jessie said. He provided for her financially for decades, and he left something for you and your family, something I've brought with me. Jessie opened the box and carefully removed the property deed. Handing it to Rosa, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the legal language, and then she looked up at him with confusion. I don't understand. This is a deed for property here in Tres Piedras, in William Cutter's name. It's yours now, Jessie said. It was always meant for you and your family. My grandfather bought that land in 1954, right after Elena died and Isabella was born. He created a trust. The property transfers to Martinez descendants upon his death. He died 2 weeks ago. The land is legally yours. Rosa stared at the deed, then at Jessie, then back at the document. 15 acres on Camino de Elena. That's the land adjacent to our property. We've wondered for years who owned it, why it was never developed or sold. It was your grandfather's way of providing for you when he couldn't do it in person, Sarah explained. He wanted to make sure Isabella and her children had something, even if he couldn't be part of your lives. How much is it worth? Rosa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jessie had looked up the property values before leaving Wyoming. Current estimates put it around $250,000. Maybe more if it's sold to the right buyer. The land values in this area have increased significantly over the years. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. We've been struggling. Since my mother got sick, the medical bills and then the funeral expenses. My brother lost his job last year, and my sister's husband has been dealing with his own health problems. This money, this property, it could change everything for us. Jessie pulled out the bank statements next, the decades of transfers carefully documented. He sent money too, every month for 56 years, $2,000 a year, sometimes more. He wanted to make sure your family had what you needed, even if you never knew where it was coming from. Rosa took the statements with shaking hands, reading through the dates and amounts. All this time, she whispered. All these years, he was thinking about us, providing for us, and we never knew. He also wanted you to have these. Jessie said, carefully removing the journal, the letters, and the photographs. "This is my grandfather's journal. It tells the whole story. His love for Elena, his grief after her death, his knowledge of Isabella, and his attempts to be part of her life from a distance. And these are the letters Elena wrote to him while he was in Korea, the originals. He kept them his entire life." Rosa touched the letters reverently, then opened the journal and began reading. Jessie watched emotions play across her face: sadness, understanding, anger at the circumstances that had kept two families apart, and finally, a kind of peaceful acceptance. "He loved her," Rosa said after a long silence. "Really loved her. You can feel it in every word. He did. And he would have loved Isabella too, would have loved all of you, if he'd been given the chance." "But Uncle Carlos was a hard man," Rosa interrupted. "I loved him, but I understood even as a child that he carried bitterness like armor. He blamed your grandfather for Elena's death, and nothing could change his mind. Not logic, not time, not my mother's gentle arguments that it wasn't William's fault. The anger defined him. My grandfather understood that," Jessie said. "He never fought back, never tried to force his way into Isabella's life. He just did what he could from a distance, and accepted that it had to be enough." Rosa stood and walked to a desk in the corner, opening a drawer and pulling out a small wooden box. She brought it back and opened it to reveal letters written in a different hand, younger, more tentative. "My mother wrote these over the years," Rosa said. "Letters to the father she never met. She never sent them, just kept them in this box. She wrote about her life, her children, her hopes and fears. She wrote asking questions she knew would never be answered. And in the last ones, written just before she died, she wrote about forgiveness, about wishing she'd been braver, about hoping he'd found peace." Jessie took one of the letters and read it, seeing Isabella's words to the father who'd provided for her, but never held her. The loss was palpable, but so was the understanding that sometimes circumstances make the ideal impossible, and people do the best they can with what they have. "I think they would have loved each other," Jessie said, "if things had been different." "I know they would have," Rosa agreed. She wiped her eyes and looked at Jessie directly. "Thank you for bringing this to us, for honoring your grandfather's wishes, for telling us the truth instead of letting the past stay buried." "He left me a letter," Jessie said. "Asked me to find you, to give you everything, to make sure you knew the whole story. I'm just doing what he asked. You're doing more than that. You're healing something that's been broken for 70 years. You're bringing two families together that should never have been separated." Rosa insisted they stay for dinner, and soon her brother Marco and sister Lucia arrived with their families. Jessie and Sarah found themselves surrounded by Isabella's descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the woman William had never known. They shared stories and photographs, compared features and discovered similarities that spanned generations. Marco had William's hands, Lucia his way of tilting her head when she listened intently. As the evening wore on, Rosa pressed some of Elena's photographs into Jessie's hands. "Keep these," she said. "They're part of your family history, too. And Jessie, stay in touch. We're family now. Let's not make the same mistakes our grandparents did," Jessie agreed, exchanging phone numbers and email addresses, promising visits and continued connection. As he and Sarah drove away from the house late that night, headed toward a motel in town, Jessie felt something he hadn't expected: peace. He'd completed his grandfather's mission, had bridged the gap between the two families, had honored William's love for Elena and Isabella in the way the old man had wanted. But more than that, he'd learned something about what it meant to leave a legacy. It wasn't about money or property or possessions. It was about love expressed through action, about caring for people even when circumstances made that care difficult, about doing what was right even when no one would ever know. His grandfather had been a good man who'd made the best of an impossible situation. That was worth remembering. That was worth honoring. The drive back to Wyoming took 2 days. Jessie and Sarah stopped at small motels along the way, eating at diners and talking more honestly than they had in years. They talked about the past, about their mistakes and misunderstandings, about the ways they'd hurt each other and the ways they'd been trying to heal. They talked about the future too, carefully, without promises or expectations, just possibilities left open to grow. When they finally pulled up to the homestead, Jesse saw it differently than he had a week ago. The weathered grey house wasn't just a structure filled with sad memories and unpaid debts. It was a place where his grandfather had built a life, despite carrying unbearable loss. It was a testament to resilience, to the human capacity to keep going even when the heart is broken. That deserved to be honored, not sold off to strangers. "I'm going to keep it," Jesse said, as they stood in the driveway, looking at the old house. "I'll figure out how to pay off the debts, take out a loan if I have to. But I'm not letting this place go," Sarah smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. You were. Jesse, you've been looking for a home your whole adult life. You just didn't realize you already had one." She gestured to the land around them. "This is where you belong, where you've always belonged." Over the next few weeks, Jesse worked with Tom Brennan to sort out the estate finances. He used what savings he had and took out a loan against the property, enough to pay off the mortgage and the outstanding debts with a little left over for repairs. It would be tight financially, but Jesse had never been afraid of hard work. He'd make it work somehow. Miguel came back full-time to help with the ranch operations. Together they mended fences, repaired the barn, started planning what crops to plant in the spring. Jesse moved back into his old bedroom, slowly making the house his own, while keeping the pieces that connected him to his grandfather's memory. He placed Elena's photograph on the mantel, right next to the wedding picture of William and Dorothy. Two women his grandfather had loved, in different ways, both deserving to be remembered. Looking at them side by side, Jesse understood something he hadn't before. Love wasn't a finite resource. William had loved Elena completely, and that love had never died. But he'd also cared for Dorothy, had built a life with her, had given her what he could. It wasn't the same kind of love, but it was real and valuable in its own right. Neither woman was diminished by the existence of the other. Sarah came out to the ranch most weekends. They took things slowly, rebuilding trust through small actions and honest conversations. She helped him paint the kitchen, and he helped her organize the photographs and documents into albums that told the complete story of William and Elena. They weren't rushing back into anything, but they weren't running away either. They were figuring out how to be together without the fear and walls that had destroyed them before. "I'm learning from Granddad's mistakes," Jesse told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He loved Elena so much that losing her nearly destroyed him. And instead of opening himself up to love Dorothy the way she deserved, he held back, protected himself, kept part of his heart locked away. "I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to spend my life protecting myself from loss instead of embracing connection." "That's good, Jesse, but you need to understand something." Sarah took his hand. "I'm willing to try again, to see if we can make this work. But I need you to be all in. No more keeping one foot out the door, no more emotional distance when things get hard. If we're doing this, we're doing it for real. I know. And I'm ready. I promise." It wasn't a declaration of undying love or a commitment to remarry immediately. But it was honest and real, and that was enough for now. Jesse started writing letters to Rosa and her family, keeping them updated on his life and learning more about theirs. Marco sent pictures of the property William had left them, showing how they'd started to develop it while keeping most of the land natural and beautiful. Lucia shared stories about Isabella that painted a picture of a woman who'd been strong and kind, who'd built a good life despite never knowing her biological father. They were family now, connected by blood and history, and the choice to honor the past while building something better for the future. On a cold November morning, Jesse stood in the barn looking at his grandfather's old saddle, still sitting where he'd left it after finding the key. The leather was worn smooth, the tooling faded, but it was solid and well made. It had carried William through decades of work, had held the secret that changed everything. Jesse decided to hang it on the wall where he could see it every day, a reminder of where this journey had started. Then he drove into town and bought a new saddle, his own, custom-made to fit him properly. The leather was stiff and smelled of fresh oil, the tooling sharp and clear. It represented a beginning, a commitment to this place and this life. He was a rancher now, a keeper of family history, a man with roots in the Wyoming soil and connections that stretched to New Mexico and beyond. As Jesse worked the land in the weeks that followed, fixing what was broken and building what was needed, he thought often about his grandfather's final letter. The lessons about love and loss, about not making the same mistakes, about living fully instead of protecting himself from pain. William had given Jesse more than property or documents. He'd given him a map for living, hard-won wisdom about what mattered and what didn't. The greatest inheritance, Jesse realized, wasn't what was written in a will or locked in a trunk. It was the lessons learned from those who came before, the love that survived death and distance, and the courage to keep trying even after failure. His grandfather had loved Elena with everything he had honored that love for 50 years while building a life that mattered. He'd provided for a daughter he couldn't raise, had cared for a wife who deserved more than he could give, had worked this land and made it productive through sheer determination. That was a legacy worth inheriting. Not the land or the house or the possessions, but the character behind them. The strength to carry grief without letting it destroy you. The determination to do right by people, even when no one would ever know. The wisdom to understand that life was imperfect and messy and full of loss. But that love, expressed through action and sacrifice and quiet daily choices, made it all worthwhile. Jesse stood in the pasture one evening as winter approached, watching the sky turn purple and gold, feeling the cold wind on his face. Somewhere in the house behind him, Sarah was making dinner. Miguel would be by tomorrow to help with the horses. Rosa had sent an email with pictures of her grandchildren. The ranch needed work. His relationship needed tending. His life was far from perfect, but it was his. Fully, completely, without reservation. He was home finally in all the ways that mattered. And he was ready to build something worth leaving behind, something his own grandchildren might find someday and understand. Not money or property, but proof that he'd lived fully, loved deeply, and honored the people who came before him by doing better than they'd managed. The old saddle hung in the barn, a reminder of secrets kept and truth revealed. The new saddle waited in the tack room, ready for tomorrow's work. And Jesse Cutter, 32 years old, and finally awake to his own life, stood between past and future, grateful for both, committed to making the most of what he'd been given. His grandfather had left him nothing and everything. Now it was up to Jesse to prove himself worthy of the inheritance.